Have you ever wondered why some Roman emperors in history are called mad? Tonight we're telling the true story of Caligula. Forbidden relationships with his sister, millions of gold coins spent insanely, methods of humiliating senators. You'll learn every detail. Welcome to Historical Stories for Sleeping. Before we begin this incredible story of an emperor whose unlimited power corrupted him beyond all recognition in the marble halls of ancient Rome, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you believe that absolute power reveals absolute character, hit that subscribe button and share this story to help us explore the darkest chapters of human history. Now close your eyes, slow your breathing, and let yourself drift back to the year 37 CE, to the glittering palaces of Rome, where a young man named Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, is about to discover what happens when there are no limits to desire, no boundaries to ambition, and no one brave enough to say no. The morning of March 16th, 37 CE, dawns gray and cold over the seven hills of Rome. In the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, Emperor Tiberius draws his final breath, his weathered face finally at peace after years of increasingly bitter rule. The old emperor dies as he lived his final years, suspicious, isolated, and deeply unpopular with both the people and the Senate. But as word of Tiberius's death spreads through the marble corridors of the palace, a very different emotion fills the air. Relief, joy, hope, because the new emperor is young, charismatic, and beloved by all who know him. His name is Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but the people call him by a nickname that speaks to their affection for him: Caligula, meaning little boots, after the miniature military sandals he wore as a child when accompanying his father Germanicus on military campaigns. Caligula is 24 years old, tall and lean with the patrician features that mark him unmistakably as a member of the Julian bloodline. His dark hair is carefully styled in the fashion of the day, his toga impeccably white, his bearing that of a man born to command. To the citizens of Rome, he represents everything they have longed for: youth instead of age, energy instead of lethargy, openness instead of the paranoid secrecy that characterized Tiberius's final years. The transition of power is swift and smooth. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers responsible for protecting the emperor, declare their loyalty to Caligula with enthusiasm. The Senate, relieved to be rid of Tiberius, grants him all the traditional powers of the Principate without a single dissenting voice. The people of Rome pour into the streets to celebrate, throwing flowers and calling out blessings on their new emperor. And Caligula seems to revel in this adoration. His first public appearances are carefully choreographed displays of magnanimity and connection with his subjects. He distributes generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard and the urban cohorts who keep order in the city. He recalls political exiles and releases prisoners who had been condemned under Tiberius's increasingly harsh rule. Most dramatically, he holds lavish public games and spectacles, spending enormous sums from the imperial treasury to provide free entertainment for the masses. The early months of Caligula's reign are marked by what historians would later call a honeymoon period. Everything he does seems to delight his subjects. When he honors the memory of his beloved father Germanicus with elaborate funeral games, the people cheer his filial piety. When he restores the practice of democratic elections for certain magistrates, elections that Tiberius had gradually transferred to the Senate, he is praised for his respect for Republican traditions. But those closest to the new emperor begin to notice troubling signs almost immediately. Lucius Macro, the Praetorian prefect, who had helped orchestrate the transition of power, watches with growing unease as Caligula's initial restraint gives way to something more unsettling. The young emperor's generosity with public funds is not just lavish, it is reckless, as if the concept of limits simply doesn't exist in his mind. More disturbing still are the subtle changes in how he speaks about his own position and authority. Where Augustus and even Tiberius had been careful to maintain at least a fiction that the emperor was merely the first citizen among equals, Caligula begins to use language that suggests a very different understanding of his role. He speaks of his divine heritage with increasing frequency. He refers to the Senate not as partners in governance, but as subjects who exist to serve his will. And there are the women. From his first days as emperor, Caligula's relationship with his three sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Livilla, attracts comment and concern among the palace staff. Roman aristocratic families are notoriously close-knit, and affection between siblings is not only normal but expected. But the level of intimacy that Caligula displays with his sisters, particularly with Drusilla, goes beyond anything considered appropriate even in a culture where social conventions are more fluid than they will later become. Drusilla is 22 years old, 2 years younger than her emperor brother. She possesses the same striking features that mark the Julian bloodline: dark eyes, aristocratic bone structure, and an indefinable quality that commands attention in any room. Like her brother, she is intelligent, articulate, and supremely confident in her own worth. But unlike her brother, she has no legal path to power in her own right. In the rigid hierarchy of Roman society, women of even the highest birth are expected to exercise influence only through their relationships with men, as daughters, wives, and mothers of those who hold official authority. The relationship between Caligula and Drusilla develops in ways that scandalize even the jaded courtiers of the imperial palace. They are seen together constantly, walking in the palace gardens with an intimacy that seems to exclude everyone else around them. They share private dinners that last late into the night, with only the most trusted servants in attendance. Most shocking of all, there are reports, whispered at first, then spoken more openly as Caligula's behavior becomes increasingly erratic, that the emperor has taken to sharing his sister's bed. In Roman culture, incest between siblings is not just morally repugnant. It is considered a crime against the gods themselves, a violation of the natural order that brings divine punishment upon the entire community. Yet Caligula seems not just indifferent to these concerns, but actively contemptuous of them. When palace officials attempt to address the situation with subtle warnings about appearances and propriety, Caligula's response is swift and chilling. He points out that the gods themselves, Jupiter with his sister Juno, for example, engage in relationships that might seem inappropriate to mortals. Since he himself is increasingly convinced of his own divine nature, why should he be bound by the petty restrictions that govern ordinary humans? This logic, if it can be called logic, becomes a recurring theme in Caligula's thinking during his first year as emperor. Any limitation on his behavior, any suggestion that he should consider consequences or conventional morality, is dismissed as irrelevant to someone of his exalted status. The financial implications of this mindset become apparent with terrifying speed. When Caligula took power, the imperial treasury contained approximately 2.7 billion sesterces, a sum so vast that it represented nearly 3 years' worth of total imperial revenue. Tiberius, for all his faults, had been a careful manager of state finances, avoiding expensive military campaigns and maintaining strict control over expenditures. Caligula depletes this entire fortune in less than 1 year. The money flows out of the treasury in torrents that astound even the emperor's own financial advisors. Lavish games and spectacles consume tens of millions of sesterces at a time. Construction projects of dubious utility, a temporary bridge across the Bay of Naples, for example, built solely so that Caligula can ride across it wearing the armor of Alexander the Great, devour resources that might have funded essential infrastructure for decades. But perhaps most disturbing of all is the casual way in which Caligula distributes wealth to those who please him, often on pure whim. A gladiator who performs particularly well might receive a villa and 50 slaves. A senator who flatters the emperor skillfully could find himself gifted with enough gold to buy an entire fleet of merchant ships. These gifts are not expressions of calculated political strategy or even consistent favoritism. They are the acts of someone who has lost all sense of proportion, all understanding that resources, even imperial resources, are finite. As Caligula's first year as emperor draws to a close, two things have become clear to those who observe him closely. First, the young man who seemed like such a promising alternative to the bitter Tiberius is transforming into something unprecedented in Roman history. An emperor who recognizes no boundaries, accepts no limitations, and believes himself to be literally above both human law and divine judgment. Second, the transformation is accelerating. By the second year of Caligula's reign, the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill has become a place where the normal rules of human behavior simply no longer apply. What begins as a day in the life of Rome's most powerful man reveals itself to be a descent into a world where unlimited power has created unlimited corruption. Caligula rises late, as is his custom. Not for him, the austere dawn rituals of earlier emperors who began their days with military exercises or consultations with advisors. The emperor's chambers are a testament to excess that would have appalled his ancestors. Silk hangings imported from China at enormous expense, furniture inlaid with ivory and precious stones, floors paved with rare marbles that cost more than most Romans see in a lifetime. But it is not the luxury itself that shocks the palace staff. The imperial household has always lived in splendor. It is the uses to which that luxury is put. The emperor's bedroom contains not just his own magnificent bed, but accommodations for companions, whose presence there violates every convention of Roman society. Drusilla has effectively moved into her brother's quarters, maintaining only the pretense of her own apartments elsewhere in the palace. Their relationship has moved far beyond the whispered scandals of the early months. It has become an open arrangement that the emperor flaunts with increasing boldness. But Drusilla is not the only occupant of the imperial bedchamber. Caligula's sexual appetites have expanded to encompass not just his sister, but a rotating collection of partners that include senators' wives, prominent citizens' daughters, and occasionally the senators and prominent citizens themselves. The emperor's bisexuality is not in itself shocking to Roman sensibilities. Many aristocratic men maintain relationships with both women and younger men. What is shocking is the complete disregard for consent, social convention, and the basic dignity of his partners. Marcus Lepidus, a young senator who had once been considered a friend and potential ally of the emperor, finds himself summoned to the imperial chambers with increasing frequency. Lepidus is handsome, well-educated, and from an ancient patrician family. Exactly the type of companion that Caligula seems to prefer. But what begins as flattering imperial attention soon becomes something far more sinister. Lepidus later confides to friends that refusing the emperor's advances is simply not an option. When Caligula desires someone's company, that person attends him, willingly or not. The emperor's mood shifts so rapidly and unpredictably that what seems like playful seduction in the morning might become violent assault by evening if his desires are frustrated. The morning routine in the imperial palace has become a careful dance of anticipation and fear. Servants never know whether they will encounter the charming, witty young emperor who delighted Rome in his early months of rule, or the increasingly unstable tyrant who might order someone's execution for the crime of looking at him incorrectly. When Caligula finally emerges from his chambers, usually around the 5th hour of the day, his appearance is as carefully orchestrated as a theatrical performance. The emperor has developed an obsession with his own image that borders on the pathological. He spends hours each morning being attended by a team of specialists, barbers, masseurs, cosmetics experts whose job is to ensure that every aspect of his appearance meets his exacting standards. But these are not the normal grooming practices of a Roman aristocrat. Caligula has begun adopting elements of dress and deportment that are explicitly designed to emphasize his supposed divine status. He wears laurel wreaths even when no triumph or religious ceremony justifies them. His togas are increasingly elaborate, made from fabrics and dyed in colors that are traditionally reserved for religious ceremonies. Most disturbingly, he has begun appearing in public wearing the attributes of various gods: Jupiter's thunderbolts, Neptune's trident, Mercury's winged sandals. The emperor's daily schedule, once organized around the serious business of governance, has become a series of elaborate entertainments designed primarily for his own amusement. The morning salutatio, the traditional ceremony where citizens and officials pay their respects to the emperor, has been transformed into a bizarre parody of itself. Instead of the dignified reception of visitors that characterizes normal imperial protocol, Caligula's morning audiences have become opportunities for humiliation and psychological torment. Senators are required to approach the emperor's throne on their hands and knees, kissing his feet before being permitted to speak. Wealthy citizens are forced to bid against each other for the privilege of presenting their petitions, with the proceeds going to fund the emperor's latest extravagances. Most disturbing of all are the loyalty tests that Caligula has begun administering to those who seek his favor. These tests often involve forcing visitors to participate in acts that violate their most deeply held beliefs or social conventions. A senator known for his strict moral views might be required to watch and applaud as the emperor engages in sexual acts with his own sister. A devout follower of traditional Roman religion might be forced to worship Caligula himself as a living god. Those who refuse these tests face immediate punishment. Those who comply find that their compliance only invites further and more extreme demands. The afternoons are typically devoted to what Caligula calls his projects, elaborate schemes and constructions that seem designed primarily to demonstrate his power to reshape reality according to his whims. The most famous of these is the temporary bridge he orders built across the Bay of Naples, a construction that requires thousands of boats lashed together and covered with earth and paving stones. The bridge serves no practical purpose. It exists solely so that Caligula can ride across it wearing the armor of Alexander the Great, demonstrating his supposed conquest of Neptune himself. The project consumes resources that could have fed half the population of Rome for a year, but when advisors attempt to point out the cost, Caligula's response is swift and terrifying. "I am Caesar," he declares. "The sea belongs to me just as much as the land. If I choose to ride across it, Neptune himself will provide the way." The bridge is completed in a matter of weeks, at a cost that bankrupts several provinces. Caligula rides across it once, declares himself satisfied with his demonstration of divine power, and orders the structure dismantled immediately. The boats are sold off to recoup a fraction of the construction costs, but the vast majority of the resources invested in the project are simply lost. This pattern, enormous expenditures for projects that exist only to satisfy the emperor's momentary whims, becomes the defining characteristic of Caligula's reign. No expense is too great, no demand too unreasonable, if it serves to reinforce his growing conviction that he is not merely emperor, but a god walking among mortals. The evenings bring perhaps the most disturbing aspects of life in Caligula's palace. What begin as simple dinner parties for the imperial family and close friends evolve into elaborate orgies that scandalize even the sophisticated courtiers who thought they had seen everything. These gatherings typically begin with conventional entertainment, musicians, dancers, poetry recitations. But as the wine flows and Caligula's mood becomes more elevated, the evening takes on a darker character. The emperor delights in forcing his guests to participate in increasingly degrading activities, using his power to strip away their dignity piece by piece. Senators' wives are required to serve as entertainment for the assembled guests. Prominent citizens are forced to watch as their daughters are violated by the emperor or his companions. Most shocking of all, family members are compelled to engage in acts with each other that violate the most fundamental taboos of Roman society. Caligula himself orchestrates these proceedings with the detached pleasure of a connoisseur arranging an art exhibition. He seems to derive particular satisfaction from corrupting those who had previously been considered paragons of virtue, as if their degradation somehow confirms his own elevation above normal human morality. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of these evening entertainments is the way they illustrate Caligula's complete inability to distinguish between different types of relationships and interactions. In his mind, sexual gratification, political dominance, religious worship, and personal affection have all merged into a single concept: the satisfaction of his desires. When he forces a senator to watch his wife's rape, he seems genuinely confused by the man's distress. When he compels family members to commit incest, he appears to believe that he is honoring them by allowing them to share in the divine transgressions that he himself enjoys with Drusilla. As the nights wear on and the wine continues to flow, even the pretense of civilization falls away. The imperial palace becomes a place where the strong prey upon the weak without restraint, where power is the only law, and where the emperor's will is the only moral authority. And through it all, Caligula watches with the satisfied expression of an artist contemplating his masterpiece, convinced that he is not destroying lives, but creating a new world, a world where gods walk among mortals and ordinary human limitations no longer apply. It is in this environment that the true extent of Caligula's transformation becomes clear. This is not simply a young man corrupted by power, but someone who has fundamentally lost the ability to recognize other people as fully human. In his mind, every person in the empire exists solely to serve his pleasure, just as every resource in the treasury exists solely to fund his whims. The palace has become a laboratory for testing the limits of human degradation, and Caligula is both the chief experimenter and the most important subject of his own twisted research. By the third year of his reign, Caligula's behavior has moved beyond mere excess and corruption into territory that can only be described as systematic megalomania. The transformation is not gradual. It happens in a series of dramatic escalations that leave even his closest associates struggling to comprehend the depth of his delusion. The first clear sign that Caligula has crossed a fundamental psychological boundary comes during a Senate meeting in the autumn of 39 C. The session begins routinely enough, with various administrative matters being discussed and voted upon. But when the discussion turns to the allocation of funds for temple maintenance, Caligula rises from his seat with an expression that silences the entire chamber. "Esteemed senators," he begins, his voice carrying a new quality that combines mockery with something approaching religious fervor. "I find myself puzzled by your concern for the temples of gods who are, at best, distant relatives of mine." A confused murmur runs through the assembled senators. Caligula continues, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each word. "Surely it would be more appropriate to direct your energies toward the proper worship of the God who stands before you now. For I am no longer merely your emperor. I am your deity, deserving of the reverence and offerings that you currently waste on Jupiter and his inferior companions." The silence that follows this declaration is absolute. For several moments, no one in the chamber seems capable of speech. The concept that a living person might claim divine status is not entirely foreign to Roman culture. The imperial cult has been developing for decades, and even Republican-era generals sometimes receive divine honors. But the idea that a sitting emperor would explicitly declare himself a god, demanding immediate worship from the Senate itself, is unprecedented. Senator Gaius Asinius Gallus, an elderly man whose family had served Rome with distinction for generations, finally finds his voice. "Caesar," he says carefully, "surely you speak metaphorically. The divine honors that are traditionally granted to emperors after their deaths." "After their deaths?" Caligula's voice cuts through the chamber like a blade. "Am I dead, Gallus? Do I appear to you to be anything less than vibrantly, gloriously alive? Why should I wait for death to receive the worship that is my due? Jupiter did not wait. Mars did not wait. Why should Caesar wait?" Gallus attempts to respond, but Caligula has already moved on, his attention shifting to the practical implications of his new status. "I will require a temple, of course, not a modest shrine, but something worthy of my magnificence. The old temple of Castor and Pollux will serve, after appropriate modifications, to reflect the superior deity who will now reside there." The temple of Castor and Pollux is one of Rome's most ancient and revered religious sites, dedicated to the twin gods who supposedly helped Rome defeat the Latins at the Battle of Lake Regillus. The idea of converting it into a personal shrine for the living emperor strikes many of the senators as not just politically dangerous, but actively sacrilegious. But no one dares to voice these concerns directly. By now, all present have heard the stories of what happens to those who oppose Caligula's wishes. The emperor's capacity for creative and brutal punishment has grown along with his megalomania, and crossing him has become a risk that few are willing to take. Instead, the senators respond with the careful enthusiasm that has become their standard defense against the emperor's increasingly erratic demands. They praise his wisdom, express gratitude for his divine presence among them, and promise to begin work on the temple modifications immediately. Caligula accepts their submission with the gracious condescension of a god acknowledging the devotion of particularly satisfactory worshippers. But those who know him best can see that something fundamental has shifted in his understanding of himself and his relationship to the world around him. The temple renovation that follows is a project that defies both architectural logic and fiscal responsibility. The existing structure is gutted and rebuilt according to Caligula's personal specifications, which seem to change daily as his vision of his own divinity becomes more elaborate. The most striking addition is a massive statue of Caligula himself, positioned where the traditional images of Castor and Pollux once stood. The statue is covered in gold leaf and precious stones, its face supposedly modeled after the emperor's own features, but idealized to the point of otherworldly perfection. But the statue's most disturbing feature is its interchangeable heads. Caligula has commissioned multiple versions of the head, each representing a different god whose attributes he claims to possess. On any given day, visitors to the temple might find the statue wearing the head of Jupiter, Mars, Mercury, or even Apollo, depending on which divine aspect the emperor chooses to emphasize. The daily worship services that Caligula institutes in his new temple are spectacles that combine traditional Roman religious ritual with elements that seem to spring entirely from the emperor's imagination. He personally presides over these ceremonies, dressed in elaborate costumes that incorporate the traditional attributes of various gods. The congregants, for that is what he calls those who attend, are required to participate in rituals that become increasingly elaborate and bizarre. They must offer expensive gifts to the divine emperor, perform complex ceremonial dances, and recite prayers that Caligula has composed himself, and which grow longer and more adulatory with each revision. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these worship services is the way they blur the line between religious observance and sexual performance. Caligula's interpretation of his divine status includes the belief that he is entitled to the same sexual privileges that the mythological gods enjoyed with mortal women. Young women from prominent families are selected to serve as temple priestesses, a role that involves participating in rituals that are explicitly sexual in nature. These women, many of them barely past childhood, are required to submit to the emperor's advances as a form of religious duty. Their families, caught between social pressure and genuine fear of imperial retribution, find themselves in an impossible position. Refusing to allow their daughters to serve in the temple amounts to rejecting the emperor's divine status, an act of sacrilege that could result in exile, confiscation of property, or death. But consenting means sacrificing their children to the emperor's increasingly unstable sexual appetites. Most choose compliance, convincing themselves that their daughters are being honored by divine attention rather than victimized by imperial abuse. This psychological defense mechanism becomes increasingly common among Caligula's subjects as his behavior becomes more extreme. The alternative to believing that the emperor's actions are somehow justified is accepting that they are powerless to protect themselves and their families from a madman. The emperor's divine pretensions extend far beyond religious ceremonies. He begins insisting that all official communications refer to him not merely as Caesar or Augustus, but as our Lord and God Caligula. Government documents are rewritten to reflect his divine status, with traditional formulations like "by order of the emperor" replaced with phrases like "by divine commandment of the god Caesar." More disturbing still, Caligula begins requiring that all citizens participate in his worship, not just those who attend temple services. Statues of the emperor in his various divine aspects are erected throughout Rome and the provinces, and citizens are required to make regular offerings to these images. The offerings themselves become a source of both revenue and entertainment for the emperor. He establishes elaborate sliding scales for the gifts that different classes of citizens must provide. Senators must offer gold and precious stones. Merchants must provide expensive imported goods, and even ordinary plebeians must contribute food, wine, or handicrafts. But the true purpose of these offerings is not economic, it is psychological. By requiring every citizen to participate in his worship, Caligula is forcing the entire population to acknowledge his divine status through their actions, regardless of their private beliefs. Those who fail to make appropriate offerings face punishments that are both severe and creatively humiliating. A merchant who provides inferior goods might find his shop confiscated and converted into a shrine to the emperor. A citizen who offers cheap wine instead of an expensive vintage might be forced to drink massive quantities of his own inferior product while being mocked by the emperor and his courtiers. As word of these requirements spreads throughout the empire, the reaction varies dramatically by region and social class. In the eastern provinces, where the worship of living rulers has ancient precedents, Caligula's demands are met with relative compliance, if not enthusiasm. But in Rome itself, and particularly among the traditional aristocracy, the emperor's divine pretensions create a crisis of conscience that threatens the stability of the entire political system. Many senators and other prominent citizens find themselves caught between their reverence for traditional Roman religious practices and their fear of imperial retribution. Some attempt to find middle ground by participating in the emperor's worship while maintaining their devotion to traditional gods. Others withdraw from public life entirely, hoping to avoid situations where they might be forced to choose between their beliefs and their safety. But a growing number begin to whisper among themselves about the possibility of more direct action. If the emperor has truly lost his mind, they reason, then perhaps it is their duty to Rome itself to find a way to remove him from power. These whispered conversations take place in private homes, in remote villas outside the city, and in the shadowy spaces between public buildings where surveillance is difficult. The participants are careful to speak only with those they trust absolutely, knowing that discovery would mean certain death. But as Caligula's behavior becomes more extreme and his demands more outrageous, the whispers begin to coalesce into something more concrete. Plans are made, potential allies are identified, and weapons are quietly acquired. The emperor, intoxicated by his own supposed divinity and surrounded by courtiers who dare not contradict him, remains oblivious to the growing conspiracy against him. He continues his elaborate religious ceremonies, his sexual predations, and his increasingly grandiose pronouncements about his own magnificence. But the seeds of his destruction have been planted, and they are beginning to sprout in the shadows of the very palace, where he believes himself to be most secure. Nothing illustrates the scope of Caligula's madness more clearly than his relationship with money. In less than 4 years, he transforms the Roman Empire from the wealthiest state in the known world into a treasury so depleted that basic government functions begin to break down. When Caligula assumes power in 37 CE, the imperial treasury contains approximately 2.7 billion sesterces, a sum so vast that it represents the accumulated savings of decades of careful financial management. His predecessor Tiberius, whatever his other faults, had been obsessively frugal with public funds, avoiding expensive military campaigns and maintaining strict oversight of government expenditures. This massive fortune should have provided the foundation for generations of imperial prosperity. Instead, Caligula treats it as a personal playground, spending money with such reckless abandon that even his own financial advisors struggle to keep track of where it all goes. The spending begins immediately after his accession, with bonuses and gifts that far exceed any precedent in imperial history. The Praetorian Guard receives payments equivalent to 5 years' salary. The urban cohorts, the fire brigades, and even the slaves who maintain the public aqueducts are showered with largesse that leaves them initially delighted and ultimately concerned about their emperor's fiscal sanity. But these initial expenditures, enormous as they are, pale in comparison to what follows. Caligula's appetite for spectacle and entertainment proves to be literally insatiable, and each event must surpass the last in both scale and extravagance. The gladiatorial games that he sponsors throughout his reign are not merely large, they are unprecedented in their scope and cost. Where previous emperors might have staged combats involving dozens of fighters, Caligula organizes battles involving hundreds. Where traditional games might last for a day or two, his spectacles continue for weeks. But it is not just the scale of these events that consumes vast resources. It is their deliberately wasteful character. Caligula seems to derive particular pleasure from destroying valuable items for the entertainment of the crowds. Exotic animals imported at enormous expense from Africa and Asia are slaughtered not for sport, but simply to demonstrate the emperor's power to waste resources that others could never afford. On one memorable occasion, he orders an entire fleet of merchant ships loaded with grain to be burned in the harbor, simply to create a spectacular fire for the amusement of spectators. The grain could have fed the population of Rome for months, but its destruction serves what Caligula considers a higher purpose, demonstrating that he is so wealthy that even necessities can be treated as disposable luxuries. The emperor's construction projects reveal an even more troubling relationship with imperial finances. These are not the carefully planned infrastructure improvements that had characterized previous reigns, but whimsical experiments that seem designed primarily to prove that Caligula's will can reshape reality itself. The temporary bridge across the Bay of Naples is perhaps the most famous example, but it is far from the only one. Caligula orders the construction of elaborate temporary buildings that are demolished as soon as they are completed. He commissions massive statues that are carved from imported marble and then smashed to pieces when they fail to meet his exacting standards. Most extravagantly, he begins construction of a palace complex that is intended to surpass every previous example of architectural magnificence. The new palace will stretch across multiple hills of Rome, connected by bridges and underground passages that will allow the emperor to travel throughout the city without ever setting foot on public streets. The palace plans call for rooms lined with precious stones, floors paved with gold leaf, and ceilings painted with scenes that depict Caligula's own divine exploits. Gardens will be filled with exotic plants and animals from every corner of the empire. Mechanical devices will create artificial weather effects, allowing the emperor to experience thunderstorms or snowfall regardless of the actual season. But the most expensive feature of the planned palace is a series of artificial lakes and rivers that will allow Caligula to stage naval battles for his private entertainment. These bodies of water will be stocked with actual warships, manned by prisoners and gladiators who will fight to the death, while the emperor watches from a golden throne position to provide the optimal viewing angle. The cost estimates for this palace complex are so staggering that even the emperor's own architects struggle to calculate them. Conservative projections suggest that the construction would consume the equivalent of 10 years' worth of total imperial revenue. More realistic assessments indicate that completing the project would require resources that exceed the total wealth of the known world. But cost considerations have ceased to play any role in Caligula's decision-making process. When advisors attempt to present him with financial reports showing the rapid depletion of the treasury, his response is typically dismissive. Money, he declares during one such briefing, is a concern for mortals. Gods create wealth through their divine will. If the treasury is empty, I will simply command it to be filled again. This attitude leads to increasingly desperate attempts to replenish imperial finances through methods that range from the questionable to the openly criminal. New taxes are imposed on every conceivable activity: walking on certain streets, using public facilities. Even looking at the emperor's statues require payment of fees that quickly become confiscatory. But the emperor's most lucrative source of additional revenue comes through a systematic program of what can only be described as legalized extortion. Wealthy citizens are summoned to the palace and informed that the emperor requires their financial support for various projects. The requests are phrased as invitations to participate in imperial generosity, but everyone understands that refusal is not an option. These voluntary contributions often amount to the confiscation of entire family fortunes. A senator might be asked to contribute the value of his country estates to support the emperor's temple construction. A merchant might be invited to fund an entire gladiatorial spectacle from his personal wealth. The victims of these extractions have no legal recourse and no practical alternatives. Those who attempt to resist find themselves charged with treason, a crime that not only carries the death penalty, but also results in the confiscation of all family property. Those who comply are typically thanked graciously and then subjected to additional demands within a matter of weeks. As the financial crisis deepens, Caligula's methods become increasingly innovative and disturbing. He begins auctioning off government positions to the highest bidders, selling provincial governorships and military commands to anyone willing to pay sufficiently inflated prices. The purchasers of these positions understand that they are expected to recoup their investments through systematic exploitation of the territories under their control. More shocking still, the emperor begins selling access to himself and his family members. Wealthy provincials can purchase the privilege of dining with the imperial household, attending private ceremonies, or even sharing Caligula's bed for a single night. These transactions are conducted with the same businesslike efficiency that characterizes other government contracts, complete with written agreements specifying exactly what services will be provided in exchange for payment. The social and economic effects of these policies ripple throughout the empire with devastating speed. The systematic confiscation of private wealth destroys the financial foundation of the Roman aristocracy, eliminating families that had maintained their prominence for centuries. The auction of government positions fills the provincial administration with incompetent officials whose primary qualification is their willingness to pay bribes rather than their ability to govern effectively. Most seriously, the emperor's fiscal irresponsibility begins to undermine the basic functions of government. Military units stationed on distant frontiers begin to experience delays in their pay, leading to disciplinary problems and desertion. Public works projects are abandoned half-completed when funds run out. The complex system of food distribution that keeps Rome's massive population fed becomes increasingly unreliable as the resources needed to purchase grain from overseas suppliers are diverted to fund the emperor's personal extravagances. By the end of his third year in power, Caligula has achieved something that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. He has brought the Roman Empire to the brink of financial collapse. The treasury that once contained billions of sesterces now struggles to maintain a balance sufficient to cover basic governmental expenses. Yet even as the crisis deepens, the emperor shows no signs of moderating his spending or acknowledging the severity of the situation. If anything, his demands become more extravagant as the available resources dwindle, as if the approaching bankruptcy only spurs him to greater heights of fiscal irresponsibility. As Caligula's fourth year as emperor dawns, the conspiracy against him has grown beyond the whispered conversations of a few disaffected senators. It now includes members of the Praetorian Guard itself, the very soldiers sworn to protect his life. Cassius Chaerea, a senior centurion in the Praetorian Guard, has emerged as the unlikely leader of the plot. Chaerea is not a political idealist or a defender of Republican traditions. He is a professional soldier whose primary concern is the stability and honor of the military institution he has served for decades. But Caligula's treatment of the guard has become a source of personal humiliation that Chaerea can no longer tolerate. The emperor delights in assigning the elite soldiers tasks that mock their military dignity, serving as actors in theatrical performances, participating in religious ceremonies that require them to prostrate themselves before his divine image, and most degradingly, providing sexual services to the emperor and his companions. When Chaerea attempts to address these concerns through proper military channels, Caligula's response is swift and humiliating. The emperor assigns him the daily password Priapus, the name of the god of male fertility, delivered as a deliberate insult to the centurion's masculine dignity. The final straw comes when Caligula announces his intention to leave Rome permanently and establish his capital in Alexandria, where he believes his divine status will be more readily accepted by subjects accustomed to worshiping their rulers as gods. This plan represents not just a personal betrayal of Roman traditions, but a practical threat to everyone whose power and wealth are tied to the city of Rome. The conspiracy crystallizes around a simple plan. Caligula will be assassinated during the Palatine Games, a festival that requires him to move through narrow underground passages beneath the palace. In these confined spaces, his usual complement of bodyguards will be reduced, and the conspirators will have their best opportunity to strike. On January 24th, 41 CE, the plan unfolds with deadly precision. As Caligula returns to the palace for a midday meal, Cheria and his fellow conspirators corner him in a narrow corridor beneath the building. The emperor, caught completely off guard, attempts to use his supposed divine status as protection. "I am a god," he screams as the first blade finds its mark. You cannot kill a god. But mortality proves stronger than delusion. Within moments, the man who had declared himself divine lies bleeding on the stone floor of his own palace. Victim of more than 30 stab wounds inflicted by soldiers he had humiliated once too often. The assassination itself is swift, but its aftermath reveals the true extent of the damage that Caligula's reign has inflicted upon the Roman state. The Praetorian Guard, having eliminated one emperor, must now find another, and their choice will be determined not by constitutional law or senatorial deliberation, but by their own institutional interests. They select Claudius, Caligula's uncle, partly because he is the only available member of the imperial family, and partly because his apparent weakness makes him seem manageable. But the fact that soldiers are choosing emperors marks a fundamental shift in the nature of Roman government that will have consequences lasting for centuries. The financial crisis that Caligula created proves more difficult to resolve than the political one. The treasury remains essentially empty, and the new emperor must implement severe austerity measures simply to keep the government functioning. Many of the victim families whose wealth was confiscated during Caligula's reign never recover their losses, creating a permanent shift in the composition of Rome's ruling class. Perhaps most disturbingly, the precedent set during Caligula's 4 years of misrule established patterns of imperial behavior that will be repeated by future emperors. The idea that unlimited power justifies unlimited license, that the emperor's personal desires supersede all law and custom, that the resources of the empire exist solely for the pleasure of its ruler. These concepts, once introduced into Roman political culture, prove remarkably difficult to eradicate. As Caligula's body is hastily buried without ceremony, those who witnessed his reign are left to grapple with the troubling question: was this an aberration, a unique combination of circumstances that produced an uniquely monstrous ruler? Or was it a revelation of what unlimited power does to anyone who possesses it? The answer, as subsequent Roman history would demonstrate, is far more disturbing than anyone at the time could have imagined. Caligula was not an exception to the normal patterns of imperial rule. He was a preview of horrors yet to come. In his death, as in his life, he serves as a warning about the corruption that absolute power breeds, and the price that entire civilizations pay when they place unlimited authority in the hands of individuals who recognize no boundaries, accept no limitations, and believe themselves to be above the laws that govern ordinary mortals. The marble halls of the imperial palace, once echoing with the sounds of debauchery and divine pretension, fall silent, but the lessons of Caligula's reign about power, corruption, and the fragility of civilized society echo through history, reminding us that even the mightiest empires are only as stable as the character of those who rule them. And in the end, character, not divine blood, not unlimited wealth, not the power of life and death over millions of subjects. Character is what determines whether a ruler builds a legacy worthy of remembrance, or becomes a cautionary tale whispered in the darkness by those who fear that such madness might rise again.